What on earth is this? This is it, ladies and gentlemen. This is not comfortable, this is a very heavily reclined bench. I'm going to have to sit like this. After years of travelling around Europe and the world, I have finally completed it. I have reached the destination. If you're not a Dutch or Flemish speaker, I'm in the village of Doel, D-O-E-L, which apparently can be translated into Dutch as the destination or the goal or the target. And I sincerely hope that me dryly explaining this joke has made it 10 times funnier than it would have been. But yes, I'm in Doel, which is a tiny village just north of Antwerp in the Belgian province of Flanders. It's squeezed in this tiny gap between Antwerp and the Dutch border and sits on the banks of the River Scheldt, right up against the bustling Port of Antwerp, Europe's second largest port behind Rotterdam. But why am I here? Well, you might have noticed that this town is looking a little bit worse for wear. It's not a bustling metropolis or even a sort of lively little village community. But despite what it looks like, which is an abandoned village lost to history, about 20 people still live here. So what's going on? Why do people still call this extremely derelict-looking village their home? Well, this strange situation is the culmination, or really just the latest chapter, of a decades-long battle between one tight-knit community and the powers that be. Doel, first mentioned in 1267 under the name Den Doelen, which I quite like, developed on reclaimed land at the edge of the River Scheldt as a cluster of farms on slightly higher ground than the tidal marshes around it. Over the centuries, it endured as a small farming and fishing village, at times isolated on a marshy island, sometimes flooded completely, and later reshaped into an artificial island along the Scheldt known as the Doelpolder, created in the 17th and 18th centuries. And while the saga we're here to talk about started in the 20th century, Doel actually has quite a fair bit of notable history, especially considering its extremely tiny size. For instance, it somehow has the oldest stone windmill in the country, dating back to 1600, and is also the home of the Doel Hooghuis, or High House, owned by the family of the ultra-famous Flemish Baroque artist Peter Paul Rubens. So that's cool. But Doel, unfortunately, is not really known for any of this, even within Belgium. Instead, its story for most people starts a few centuries later. While Antwerp had been a port for centuries, in 1811, Napoleon as always, commissioned the first major dock complex to be built at Antwerp, noting the city's potentially strategically advantageous position as his mad empire spread across Europe. Even in the years after we sent Napoleon off to a little island in the Atlantic to die a miserable, lonely death, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and subsequently Belgium post-independence, were like, oh shit, this guy was onto something, and continued to expand the port. By the turn of the 20th century, business was booming in Antwerp. Ships of all sizes were coming and going at all times of the day and night, and following World War II, which thankfully didn't deal out too much damage to the Port of Antwerp, plans were made to really diversify the port's remit and expand into other revenue streams. God, that sounded all very corporate, didn't it? Why did I write that? Surprised I didn't accidentally say the word synergize halfway through that sentence. Looking to expand into oil and petrochemicals, the port searched around for a bit more space in which to fit docks built specifically for those commodities. And so they looked north up the Scheldt, carving out two mammoth docks on the right bank of the river across from Doel. As the expansion swallowed up parts of the eastern bank, a number of medieval villages were completely demolished, such as Oerderen and Oosterweil, and Doel sat across the river watching this destruction go down, gently sweating but playing it cool so nobody noticed. Predictably, with time, even these massive new docks became insufficient as trade and transport exploded across the globe in the 1950s and 60s, with bottlenecks forming and slowing everything down. And so they started looking at the west bank of the Scheldt. Oh no, Doel. In 1963, just as the citizens of Doel had feared, the Belgian government approved the linker-over or left bank expansion to balance out Antwerp's massive right bank growth, with a huge collection of deep-sea docks given the go-ahead to start construction just south of Doel, such as the Vaasland Canal, the Verrebroek Dock, and the Vrassener Dock. I'm so sorry, Dutch people, these are very hard words to say. Construction began on these in the late 60s and continued well into the 70s. But most problematically for Doel was the Belgian government approving the construction of the the Doel dock, another massive deep water dock that would unfortunately require the destruction of Doel and much of the Doel polder with it. This is because they wanted to link the top of the Doel dock to this wetland area up here through the construction of the Belgian Canal. The construction of the Doel dock also began in the late 60s, with the 1,400 citizens of Doel realizing that their time was probably up, and with the Belgian Canal works on the horizon, the town was handed a permanent building ban in 1968 so that it couldn't expand any further or attract more residents, encouraging people to move away. By this time, many had preempted the inevitable and began packing up, with Doel's population decline firmly underway by 1969. However, the town then got a massive stay of execution when the Belgians suddenly remembered that their plans for the Belgian Canal required construction on Dutch land, and this led to a big back and forth, not actually between Belgium and the Netherlands, but between Flanders and Wallonia, who disagreed over many elements of the plan, and it was all put on hold. But in the meantime, the Belgian government also gave the go-ahead for a gigantic nuclear power plant to be built just north of the village, trapping Doel in between two major infrastructure projects. So even though the Belgian Canal had been indefinitely shelved by this point, the walls were still closing in fast on Doel. But then, everything changed. The 1970s came around and the oil crisis, along with a few other things, sent Belgium into a massive recession which demonstrated that maybe they'd been a bit too ambitious with their port extension plans. Furthermore, a protest movement had started in Doel by this point, causing a very intentional headache for the government. With all this going on, construction on the Doel docks stopped halfway through, and plans for further docks were scaled back massively. Thus, the 1970s were an interesting sort of limbo time for the people here, because while the town had been spared from destruction immediately, the people here were aware that the Belgian government still wanted them gone. And if the macroeconomic situation in Belgium improved anytime soon, Doel would be first on the chopping block. And so the exodus continued, with the population halving to around 700 by the late 1970s. 1975 saw the completion of the first reactor and cooling towers at the Doel nuclear plant, meaning the power station would now dominate the skyline of the village for the foreseeable future. But then, in 1978, something kind of weird happened, which was that Mark Aiskens, who was the Secretary of State for the Economy of Belgium, flew to the town by helicopter and told the residents of Doel that the village would be allowed to remain forever, which was a kind of an odd thing to do, considering it was pretty redundant considering this town was already well on the way to becoming a ghost village by that point. Also a fun fact that made me chuckle. Oh my god, a car. Ghost village in Dutch is spookdorp. Dutch is a funny language. Nevertheless, this comment from Aiskens convinced some people to stay, and so Doel entered the 1980s with cautious optimism, which, surprisingly, paid off. Back in 1977, Doel had already lost its independence, becoming part of the much larger municipality of Beveren. But now, with the dockworks suddenly stalled in the mid-1980s, that turned out to be an opportunity. Instead of preparing the village for demolition, in 1985, Beveren officially designated it as a regeneration zone and started throwing money at it to bring it back to life. Young families were encouraged to move there and buildings were restored. For 10 years, things were looking bright. But in 1998, it all went to shit again. Belgium's economy had undergone another recession in the early 1990s, but it bounced back with a vengeance in the mid to late 90s, with plans surfacing showing that the Belgian government once again wanted to resurrect their plans for the west bank of the Scheldt and destroy Doel to make space for a massive container dock, the Saftinger dock. And so the continued existence of Doel was once again cast into doubt. The town was designated an industrial zone, thus making its prospective destruction easier. Plenty of people had been offered payment to leave the town, and so hordes of people began abandoning the town once again. By the year 2000, the population had dropped to just 300, and the dream of Doel rising from the ashes like a phoenix was now pretty much dead. But a small, stubborn few refused to give in, and by the mid-2000s, with construction of the Saftinger dock still not underway, a few local residents formed Doel 2020, an activist group with the sole aim of saving Doel from destruction. And by this point, the town's population was just 202 people. But during this time, Doel actually developed a reputation as a sort of squatter's paradise. And in 2003, I believe an estimation was given that about 200 squatters had moved into the town, meaning that although the town's population had fallen to 200 officially, it had actually, in reality, gone up because of all these people moving in. Initially, this situation was tolerated by the authority overseeing the West Bank development, which owned the properties, as well as the municipality of Beveren, as nothing was really happening in the town, so it didn't matter. But after media attention raised a slight panic about alleged lawlessness in the town, by the end of 2006, all squatters had either been made official residents through employment schemes or evicted. Unfortunately, demolitions began in 2008, with the Doel 2020 group desperately trying to save the village and taking the local authorities to court multiple times throughout the 2000s. The first success came in 2008, when a court ruled that the town should be reverted back to residential status rather than industrial, which put a massive spanner in the works of the people trying to expand the Port of Antwerp. But to bypass this, the Belgian government instead issued an eviction order for everyone in the town, saying that they had to leave by the 1st of September 2009. However, in May 2009, everything changed again. That month, the Ghent Court of Appeal issued a summary judgment halting all demolitions, followed by a ruling from the Court of First Instance in Dendermonde that every individual violation of this rule would incur a €1 million penalty, meaning that every time they tried to demolish a house or they knocked down any sort of building, they would have to pay €1 million. And in August the same year, another court ruling found that tenants could no longer be evicted, again imposing penalties for any attempts to do so. This eviction ban has since been extended multiple times and remains in place today. God knows how they did it, but the Doel 2020 group actually managed to save this village that could not have been more primed for demolition than it was. It is the entire village equivalent of a nail house, whereby one person refuses to sell their house or move to make way for an infrastructure project, meaning the plans have to be altered to accommodate it. And that's exactly what happened with Doel. In 2018, a revised plan for the development of more docks on the west bank of the Scheldt took Doel into account, and all the docks will be constructed around the village rather than on top of it. And 2022 saw even more good news, with the formation of the, quote, Alliance for the Future and the Quality of Life in the Port of Antwerp's surrounding area, the polders of the left bank of the Scheldt. Maybe its name sounds better in Flemish, I don't know. Basically, this earmarked hundreds of millions of euros to the preservation of Doel and the residents and wildlife areas directly around the village. Furthermore, the Doel power plant is due to be decommissioned fully by 2035, meaning these cooling towers will be knocked down and people may be attracted to move back into the town. Just for the record, I'm a massive believer in nuclear power and think this is a terrible idea, but at least it will be beneficial for Doel's skyline, I suppose. I don't know. So Doel had been saved. Full stop, case closed, line drawn under. And in the battle of village versus port, the village had won a decisive victory. But while this story is heartwarming on paper, the truth is that it feels like there isn't really a huge amount to celebrate here. While the town was spared from destruction, the community that once called it home have long gone, and only 20 people remain here. It has instead become a mecca for graffiti artists who have plastered every square inch of the town with paint, and thus has this rather subversive alternative atmosphere that is quite cool and a bit surreal, but it's not really a home anymore. While Doel has been saved, this story is still an example of how, even if the legislators and courts side with the underdog, the pressure exerted on communities that lie in the way of major construction projects can still be enough to effectively destroy them anyway. And so we're left with this strange little town where it's at one time guarded by multiple layers of legal protection, but also just mostly abandoned. And so here's hoping that one day the citizens of Doel can return, or a new wave of people arrive, and make this the thriving community it once was. This time without the threat of destruction constantly hanging over them. And that's it for Doel. As always at the end of these videos, I like to do a recommendation as to whether or not you should come to these places, and I say certified, don't come to Doel. It's kind of hard to get to and is surrounded pretty much by the Port of Antwerp, which is just hideous. And the town itself is obviously derelict and there's nothing to do here, unless obviously you're a graffiti artist or you want to come film it. I mean, maybe one day it will be back on its feet. Maybe it will be a bustling metropolis with 4,000-foot skyscrapers everywhere and a water park. I don't know why a water park is the first thing that came to mind. It's like a child. Yeah. My fiance is laughing at me from behind the camera, so I'm going to go now.